Hi, I'm Prophet Azad, and you're watching Atheist Edge.
Okay, I am here with Dr. Zachary Moore, and you were just on the show. We were at the Bible and Beer Consortium. That was a couple weeks ago, doing the Tom Jump and Ben Arbor debate.
Yeah, we had an impromptu prayer session.
Right, that's right. And we have since, I guess that's 2 or 3 weeks, we have since been trying unsuccessfully at least 4 times to get together and do this. This is, so finally it's going to happen. There is a YouTuber named Atheism versus Logic. That's his YouTube channel.
Love the name.
Yeah, right off the bat. But it's Jeremy Spry, and I'm not going to call him a troll. He seems like, okay, I'm going to give him some props. He's intellectually honest from what I can tell.
That's good.
I'm going to share the screen with you before I even delve into. So Zach, you are a PhD in molecular biology.
I do have a PhD in molecular biology. Got it back in 2005. So you can call me Dr. Zach or whatever. It's fine.
One other thing, we are recording this on 10 November, so I'm not going to make you call me Master Sergeant Hall, but today happens to be the Marine Corps birthday, and so shout out to all my fellow devil dogs, leathernecks, and jarheads out there.
Hoorah!
Yes. Let's get plugs out of the way right up front too. So, what have you been working on? What do you have in the future, and where can people find you?
Yeah, so I produced one of the very first things I did sort of in the public sphere was a podcast called Evolution 101, which I produced because there was no evolution-focused podcast that existed at the time. To my knowledge, there still is none other than that. And so it still gets quite a lot of downloads, and it's humbling, encouraging, and a bit embarrassing because it was literally me right out of graduate school just trying to put a little introductory information out there. So there's Evolution 101, which a lot of people know about me from. Then there's another podcast I did called Apologia, which is still semi-active. So that's apologia-podcast.net if you're interested in that. And then in terms of local community organizing, I've been involved with the Fellowship of Free Thought in Dallas, FOFDallas.org, as well as Camp Quest Texas, so campquesttexas.org as well.
You currently hold a leadership billet in the Fellowship of Free Thought?
Yeah, I'm still a board member there.
Okay.
And I kind of help out with Camp Quest Texas still. I'm hoping to be a volunteer for the next season, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm on the board of directors at Metroplex Atheist for another 17 November is the voting for the next time around, and I am stepping down because I can't juggle this channel and Metroplex Atheist. I'll help out when I can, but yeah, that's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's quite a lot. At one point, at my most intrepid, I was on the boards. I was on 4 different boards, 4 different secular organization boards at one time, and that was a challenge.
And if you have a full-time job, it's our current president, Courtney Stewart. I mean, she works full time and she's trying to juggle, and I see it. It's taxing, very taxing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as far as evolution specific, you have found your niche. That's for sure. Because I'm trying to think. I mean, there are some.
There's some science podcasts that touch on it, but there's nothing. There's been nothing. Well, and there are some creationist podcasts that have been put out there to criticize evolution, but no other podcast, to my knowledge, that was designed to put good scientific information out there about evolution that people could understand. So that's why I called it 101, because it was really for just the average person, almost like I'm explaining this to my mother.
Then that's what we want. And it's funny you should mention creationist podcasts out there, because we're going to touch on that. And the only one that comes to mind that I watch is, Aaron Ra's got the phylogeny. So right. he does the classification. He's heavy on the classification. True. Yeah.
That's probably the closest it gets. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to do a screen share. This is how it all started. Jeremy Spry, he's prolific on our social media and our YouTube comments. And okay, first things first, he's respectful and amicable. I'll give him that. But he loves to
Isn't it kind of sad that that's something that you would have to take note of? Like this sort of marks him out as different from the other creationists that are out there.
Yeah,
That's
it actually does.
sad.
And it is sad. But, in his defense, we have our share as well.
Yeah, okay, that's fair.
Yep. All right. So it kind of hit a boiling point where, listen, man, he doesn't spam like a lot of our fans do, copy and paste the exact same thing on multiple videos. He does reword it for the most part, but he will he's a one-trick pony. He's got one talking point, and it's irreducible complexity. And he'll put it in videos that have zero to do with even evolution itself. And it's like he's hijacking our topics. And I said, dude, so anyway, I said, here, try to stay on topic instead, substantiated pet pseudo theory. And it got started here. And so the next one, this is where I ask him, listen, it sounds real good. I'm interested to learn more. Show me some published peer-reviewed literature. And let's start there. And he says he doesn't think he can, because academia, I don't know, it's some sort of this huge conspiracy. Yes, thousands and thousands of people are in on it too, I guess. That anything that's outside of materialism just gets eschewed and doesn't even get considered for publication. And so he says, check out Douglas Axe, a book, Undeniable. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I've met Doug Axe. Yeah, he's...
Oh, really? Okay. Wow.
A piece of work.
All right, so that's where we're at. And here are the questions. I'll let you read them. I'm just going to kind of...
Yeah, so these are interesting questions, and as you note, these all sort of circle around the same basic idea of irreducible complexity, right? So, how do you explain some complex thing, some system? In here, he's talking about molecular biology. So, he's talking about ribosomes, he's talking about microtubules. This is the realm of molecular biology. And he's saying we've got some sort of a complex system that exists, and if you screw around with one aspect of this, or with some other aspect of it, assumes some other molecule that has to exist for it to function properly, right? So you can't just evolve this one protein along a pathway by itself. You've got to have this other protein being evolved in the same way. And how do you get one with the other? Sort of like a chicken and egg thing, right?
Right.
And this is all irreducible complexity. So, you can address all of these just by all the different refutations that have been already made by Michael B. About Michael B.'s work. So Michael B. He is a is he a molecular biologist? I think he is a
I know he does have advanced degree in something, a field of study that is applicable. And he was their big star. Yeah, he was their big star. He, among others, at the Dover trial, which at some point in this video, I'm going to cut to a couple excerpts, maybe video clips or stuff. If you're not, if the viewers are not familiar with the Dover, Pennsylvania trial, there was irreducible complexity, which was masquerading as something new. Not, in fact, I don't know. Do you want to explain the C design? What is it? C design proponentists.
And that article mentioned that a man named Charles Thaxton, now a fellow at the Discovery Institute, was working on a book that would present both evolution and creation.
The academic editor was Charles Thaxton, who was the editor of the Pandas book. So it was clear that ad was referring to the Pandas project. What was interesting is that it talked about the book being about creation and evolution instead of the later terms intelligent design and evolution.
If they could show Pandas started out as a creationist book, that would suggest intelligent design is simply creationism repackaged, and therefore inherently religious.
Yeah, do you want to explain that, and maybe the Dover trial and Michael B.
Yeah, so the Dover trial was focused on a textbook, and the textbook was called Of Pandas and People. If you want to cross-link maybe to the BBC talk I gave on intelligent design, I talk a lot about the history of this book and where it came from. Did you know that Of Pandas and People originally came out of Dallas?
I think I did at one time, because Texas is a textbook origin point. Us in California.
No. So that's a separate thing.
Oh.
So there was actually an organization. It was a fundamentalist Christian organization based in Dallas that specifically decided that they wanted to create a biology textbook for fundamentalist Christian homeschoolers. And so they put the wheels in motion of the textbook that eventually became Of Pandas and People. And the first person to latch on to this book that you probably would have heard of is Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute. So he came, I don't know exactly all the details of how exactly he got involved with the book, but he came to know that this book was being together, and either invited himself, or because of his enthusiasm for it, was invited onto the project. But he arrived on the project in between the first and second drafts, which is where that screw up that you mentioned. Because initially they were talking about creation scientists, right? So the book Of Pandas and People came about at this transitional point in the evolution of creationism, where initially the field was called creation science, and it was called creation science, I argue, because of oh shoot, what's the guy's name? I just lost his name. The flood guy, the geologist.
Gish or Ham?
No, earlier than that.
Oh,
I mentioned all that in my video. I have better notes than that. But so it was in the wake of the Sputnik launch, right? So you had the Scopes monkey trial back in the 1920s that challenged this evolution concept, right? And legally, what happened there in the trial, the people who were teaching evolution lost because it was against the law to teach evolution. But the exploration of creationism and the process by which they went through, what are we actually teaching kids when we're teaching them creationism? It all made it look stupid, and like we're teaching them fairy tales. And so creationism became very sort of unpopular outside of the South after the Scopes trial. And then when Sputnik was launched, the entire country sort of realized, you know what, we have really not paid attention to science education in this country for a long time. And now we've fallen behind the Soviet Union because they got one step ahead of us in the space race. They launched the first artificial satellite. And so the entire country cranked up their sort of pro-science PR, let's say. And all of a sudden in the 50s and 60s, science was the most amazing thing in the world, and you had science fiction and scientists coming up with new amazing technologies, and scientists were they weren't necessarily the coolest people, but they were doing the most interesting things and making your life better. Every year there'd be some scientific discovery, and so everything was very pro-science. Well, it was at that point that creation science evolved. So it used to be just flat out creationism, and then it became creation science. And so by adding science onto it, they gave it a sense of legitimacy. Okay, we're not just teaching creationism, which everyone agreed since the 1920s is just an embarrassing fairy tale that we're trying to teach kids. Now we're teaching creation science. And so that's when you get the origin of this concept.
It's just to lend an air of legitimacy.
Absolutely.
And
that's all it was.
Side note, are you seeing it now, like a new wave of anti-intellectualism with our current political climate? And you see it coming back now. It comes in waves, like history repeats itself.
It does. And it clearly is fairly disturbing and distressing on the right side of the political spectrum. That's because that's where the fundamentalists are concentrated, right? So the old fundamentalists, I would argue, are the new evangelicals, and are quickly becoming like the only Christians that are left, because most of the progressive Christians are kind of leaving Christianity and they're becoming nuns. And so in about 20 years' time, depending on what happens, but the trends would suggest that in 20 years' time, pretty much the only Christians that will be left will be the fundamentalist evangelicals. And so those are very, very tightly aligned with right-wing politics in this country anyway. And so to the extent that they have power and are able to put judges on the circuits to support their ideas,
Right.
then we are concerned about that. There is also, there are anti-science sentiments on the left side of politics. There's
Anti-vaxxers.
Well, and anti-vaxxers, I would argue, would actually be a kind of interesting intersection. So
Yes.
you've got very left-leaning people and very right-leaning people that are kind of united in their opposition to vaccination for whatever reason. So you can find it across the spectrum.
I don't wish the complete abolishment of supernatural beliefs in general, but like you said, given this current trend of the nuns, and it looks like if it continues as it's going now, we will become the majority. I don't wish for Christians any persecution. I know they have they're 73% of this country's population, but they still cry out persecution when Starbucks doesn't put Christmas on their cups, even though there's a pagan water goddess on every Starbucks cup already. They don't realize that, but it does. I would wish it to be relegated to the dustbin of history. Like, oh, look, that's just it's an anomaly. Now, I would never mock a person, but I'll mock ideas all day. And where it just becomes, oh, that's, like it is in Europe, a lot of countries in Europe, even countries that have an official religion, they think it's just quaint, the believers, and they go to church more as a just following social norms rather than
Right.
actual belief system. That's how I see it. Maybe us in the future, hopefully.
Yeah, and there's so I'm active with some of the progressive believers that are out there, Christians, Jews, Muslims, whatever. The ones that come together and can have common cause with me as a humanist, as a secular humanist, those are good people to have around it. And I value their input, not just because they're good people, but I value their input because, look, it's possible they may be in touch with something that I'm not in touch with. It's possible they may know something that I don't know. I'm not arrogant enough to say that I have it all figured out for all time, and nothing can ever challenge where I am right now. I already changed my belief system in a fairly major way once already, and I'm happy to do it again. If I need to do that, then I'll happily do that. And so I like having good progressive believers around, people that are not anxious about having contact with atheists and humanists and people for whom their faith is not fragile, unlike the people who are creationists and other fundamentalists. The reason why creationism is even a thing is because their faith is so fragile that it cannot handle any sort of challenge, right? So the main reason why there is even a creationism movement, the reason why the Discovery Institute exists, and other institutes like it, ICR, for example, is because they're afraid. They're afraid, and they have a very, very fragile faith that cannot handle any sort of challenge to what they already believe, right? So this is why they have to circle the wagons. They can only understand the Bible in a very literal way. And they will do anything they possibly can to prevent themselves from having to add any information to the worldview or make some modification to the worldview. It is a position that is created by fear. and
Yeah.
that is what we see. So that's the reason why these creationists do what they do. They are afraid. There's one pastor, in fact, who sort of said the soft part loud one time when he was with me. So I met him for lunch one time. And this was prior to, we were going to do like a discussion debate sort of a thing at his church. And he wanted to meet me for lunch ahead of time and just, sort of talk over the topics and stuff and get to know me a little bit. And we sat down at the table. And as we sat down, he set his hands on the table and I could see they were shaking like this. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's got some sort of a neurological disorder or something like that, or some palsy or whatever. And I said, are you okay? Is everything, all right with you? You're shaking. And he said, oh, I'm just really afraid. And I said, oh, is everything okay? He's like, well, no, I'm sitting down to talk with an atheist, and you might say something during this lunch that will cause me to give up my faith. And that terrifies me.
If your pillars of faith are that fragile, man,
Well,
you need to rethink your belief system.
But
I
he was being brutally honest with me, and he was, and as I came to work with him a little bit more, I understood that he was just a very sort of hard on your sleeve sort of a guy, very open, and he was, absolutely telling me the truth. And that's a thing that we sort of suspect that all the other fundamentalists that we interact with, they're coming from the same place. And I think that probably is true. For him, he was happy to be explicit about it.
That's
which
good on
I
him.
thought was great. But so this is the reason why creationism is even a thing, and I talk about this also a bit in my BBC talk, where you had at the same time in this country, in the latter part of the 19th century, you had two ideas coming in from Europe that were very challenging to a lot of the pew potato believers, the people that were just sort of there and didn't really move intellectually past Sunday school. So Darwin's theory, so evolution by natural selection, that was coming over. So that was accepted science by the end of the 19th century, and it was coming over into America. And our institutions of higher learning were accepting this and distributing this, and this was becoming a thing. And this is the reason why evolution was even being taught in Tennessee in the 1920s, because it had filtered through to the extent that you could teach it, and people felt comfortable teaching it. The other thing that was coming over was sort of higher critical analysis of the Bible. So this was primarily out of Germany and the Netherlands and sort of like Northern Europe. Theologians there were taking closer and deeper looks at the scriptures and comparing, not just comparing different copies of the text, right? So that's sort of textual criticism. That's the sort of thing that Bart Ehrman is an expert at. But they were looking at what can we learn about the documents themselves by analyzing what's in them. Can we learn anything about the source documents that might have been used to create these scriptures, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all the letters. Can we analyze them? Can we learn anything about them? The same way that you might try to analyze, let's say, the works of Shakespeare, the same way you might try to analyze the works of Homer, and say, well, did one hypothesis that might be out there is, well, did Homer derive anything of the Iliad from like an earlier Sumerian epic? Did he just sort of take a lot of the themes that were from an earlier Sumerian epic and work those into the Iliad? That would be a very non-controversial study and analysis to do if you're doing that with something like Homer, where the stakes are very low spiritually.
Yeah.
But if you do the exact same thing with the Bible, and you say, wait a minute, did the Bible import themes from previous pagan documents?
There is a YouTuber, Truth Surge. He's one of the old school YouTubers. We've had him on the show. He does an entire, like a 17-part series where he connects Homer to biblical, and it was,
you can do that too. Yeah, and it's very interesting and it's fascinating, right? And if you were just doing that in just like classical studies, right? If you're just doing that using the old Latin or Greek texts, who cares, right? That's something for the academics in their ivory tower to be concerned about. But if you do the exact same thing, the exact same methods, the exact same analysis, you do that with the Bible, wait a minute, what are the implications for me and where I'm going after I die? Is everything that I believed in my life a lie? And people get really,
Frantic.
freaked out. They get freaked out, and that's what happened in this country is people got really freaked out. And there was a very, very sort of spiritually violent, I guess you might say, reaction to these two things. So it was the higher criticism, source criticism, and Darwinism together. And to reject those, there's a group of American theologians and, quite frankly, just a lot of lay believers who got together and came up with what they called the fundamentals of the faith. And it was a collection of essays sort of outlining their positions. And these were published in Chicago in the 1910s. And that's where we get the term fundamentalist. A fundamentalist is someone who affirms the tenets and the ideas that were published in the fundamentals of the faith. And the two main ones that you absolutely have to reject are the idea that the Bible can be analyzed in the same way that Homer or any of these other epics were analyzed. And you also have to reject Darwinism, because if Darwinism is true, then man is just an animal, and man has no soul, and man is not going to heaven, and blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And everything falls apart like a house of cards, right?
No matter how many facts you stack on that theory, they cannot accept it, because their whole house of cards would fall.
Right. And all you have to do is just read. You can look up the fundamentals of the faith. You could read through them. Just read the frantic terror that these people are expressing in these essays. They're so afraid that these ideas are going to tear down Christianity, because for them, their Christianity is very fragile, and it can be torn down. And I say, if your belief is that fragile that it can be torn down, then it should be torn down,
right?
And you should build something stronger, or something more resilient.
Yeah. Let me put that back up on the screen, and let you just kind of gloss over it and take a look at, so we can, the purpose of this was to directly answer Jeremy's questions. So they're all basically similar. And they're all, intelligent design, irreducible complexity. Now, I'll give you my layman's, because I've read the entire court. I know that I'm geek, but I read the entire transcript from the Dover trial. I watched on BBC or National Geographic. They did a full documentary, and it was, I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. But it takes you through everything, the steps, and just how humiliated the one side was, and so okay, bacterial flagellum motor, they really touched on that a lot. And this is an organism, a single cell organism that can propel itself by use of kind of a ball and socket joint. Now, this is a layman talking. It's like a tail, but it's on a ball and socket. And it can spin and propel itself through the medium. And so it's this tail that, spins it through the medium. And they're saying there's no way that could have been, if you take any part, there's, all these multiple parts of the motor that runs that spinning joint, that propulsion system. You take any one of those pieces out, it wouldn't work. And then in the course of the trial, they said, well, here's an earlier form of that bacterial flagellum, and it's called I think it's the type 3 secretor, and that tail was actually used as a tube for injecting its genetic material into other cells. So it was proven that an earlier step, but it had a different purpose. It just the purpose, it repurposed.
Well, pretty much I'm pretty sure all the examples that Behe put in his book, Darwin's Black Box, have since been completely refuted, including just the concept of the mousetrap as this sort of perfect example of an irreducibly complex system, because you can take out the little catch thing and bend the hook a little bit, and it works just fine. So even the idea that the mousetrap is an irreducibly complex system is not true.
Someone said, well, as far as just back to my point about repurposing, the mousetrap might not work for catching mice if you take this one part out, but it makes a great tie clip. Remember that?
Exactly. And so that is the larger rebuttal to any of these irreducibly complex systems is, well, we don't know, we might not have a clear set of molecular fossils, let's say, showing how this got to this, but there's loads of examples how this thing in some other form could work in a different way, right? Or, so that's one, is it may have been used for some other purpose and it got imported, like, for example, the secretory system being repurposed as the flagellum. Or another thing that happens is over time, systems that might have been necessary to bring one molecule forward evolutionarily could have then become irrelevant or made redundant and is not needed anymore, and then is selected against and removed. And so you don't see this, you don't see that product. So that's what's referred to as scaffolding, right? The sort of scaffolding concept, right? So you go and you see this huge stone arch that is built someplace, wherever, and you think to yourself, how in the world did they get those stones to just sit there while they built this arch over it? Well, they built a scaffold underneath it and laid the stones and then poured the cement, and then when everything was dry and set, then they took the scaffold out. So you come by later, you don't see the scaffold, and what you're doing is you're basically saying, how in the world could you even build this thing without having any building, right? How does a roof get up on a building, right? Because if you're asking the question of, well, the roof would just have to appear on its own in one big chunk, or else it couldn't exist at all. Well, you're fundamentally not understanding how houses are built. Houses are built in pieces, and you don't add something unless you've got support for it. You can't build a third floor unless you have the second floor built, right? This is just basic stuff. And so all these questions completely miss that.
Richard Dawkins, he talks about crane. He's got an analogy for cranes. I don't remember it. He does have another analogy called climbing Mount Improbable, where you're looking straight up this cliff face and you're thinking, how could we have evolved from down here to up there? And it's no way a single step, but then you look on the backside of the mountain and it's this gradual slope all the way up to it. So that's kind of how I see it. The scaffolding, it might be a similar analogy.
Well, and it's kind of similar, but all you have to do is look at a Chihuahua versus a Great Dane, right? Right. Exactly. How did you get the same animal? So these are the same species, right? We know that these all came from some ancestral dog at some point. Right? Even the creationists believe this. If you go to the Creation Museum in Kentucky, they've got a display that shows how the species of dog came about. But the difference between those is just so amazing, and you're like, they're so different in size and shape, and they can't even mate with each other, right? If you wanted to make a mix, you'd have to do it artificially.
Wait, a Great Dane and a Chihuahua can't? I thought any domesticated canine could mate with each other.
Well, in theory, but how are they going to?
They're all in the same family. The physical logistics.
What I'm saying is, you leave a Chihuahua with a Great Dane, and they might like each other a lot, but they're not having kids together.
Well, I know for a fact a dachshund mated with a Saint Bernard once, and I know exactly when it happened. The Saint Bernard was mine. The dachshund was my grandparents.
Which one was the female?
The female was the Saint Bernard, but she was asleep on her side when the dachshund came up.
Oh,
yeah, so it worked.
Well, okay.
Okay,
That's an enterprising dachshund.
I know, man. He had a mission. Okay, this first one. Of course, he uses the word accidentally. So there's your buzzword right there. He's trying to discredit it from the beginning. But then this nucleotide sequence, Zach, can you tell me if there was if every step in the process would be beneficial, it would have to be for our side to be true, for this nucleotide sequence to send the right ribosomes in the right order to make the proteins for
So
the okay.
there's all sorts of things that are wrong here.
Okay.
Right? So number one, he's sort of reified nature, right? So nature is a thing that has intent and can achieve goals, apparently, right? So nature, and this is a very common sort of a conceptual mistake that we all sort of make, and even scientists, when they talk about evolution, they use this language as kind of a shortcut because it helps people understand what's going on, because we are intention-seeking sort of creatures. We look for other people. We try to understand how other people are working by thinking what their intentions might be, right? And so when we see natural processes take place, our natural inclination is to do the same thing that we do with other people, to say, what are they thinking? Why are they doing this? What is their intention here? And so we do that with things that have no intention, like the weather and the ocean, right? And that's why we create weather gods and ocean gods, is because we want something to exist to be the focus of that intention, to be the focus of that reification. So what he's doing here is exactly that. He's reifying the concept of nature as something that does something, and it is not that, right? So that's sort of mistake number one. Mistake number two is accidentally, right? So that creates an idea in your head that, well, nature's sitting there and is just throwing out things at random, right? And it's like, pulling things out of a hat. Well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this, whatever. And, out of these million, things that might happen that nature is trying to do, like nature is some sort of, idiotic cobbler that's trying to make shoes by throwing leather and nails together, just kind of at random. This is how you make shoes. You just, no, that's not what's happening at all. So there's accidental components to evolution, which is say random components to evolution, which is the
mutation process.
Right. So the mutation. Well, there's other things as well, but that's a big one, right? So when replication happens, there's a certain chance that any given nucleotide that's added is wrong. It happens very, very infrequently, but most organisms have genomes that are pretty large, or the ones that have small genomes tend to replicate pretty quickly. And so the more replication that happens, even if you have a small rate of mutation, then that will happen. It's just inevitable that there will be certain mutations that happen. Every single human being, by the size of our genomes and our mutation rate, every single human being is born with about 700 novel mutations. And that's just, that's just a fact. And where those mutations exist is random, relatively random. There's certain domains of the genome that make it more likely than others. But it's not like it, only this place or only this place or only this place. It's a fairly random thing. So that is the accidental thing that happens in nature is the mutation and where they might happen. The other thing that happens in nature that's sort of accidental is sort of everything else that might happen to an organism. Is there's all these different things that might happen. Whether you get struck by lightning, whether your entire population is caught in a flood and wiped out. Those can be random, what we call stochastic things that might happen. So there's a lot of accidental things that happen in nature. You might say, I mean, if what he's getting at with accidental is just not intentioned, all of nature is accidental. Because nature is not an intention thing, right? So anything that might happen within the realm of nature is by definition accidental. So having it here in this sentence means nothing. We're just talking within the scope of the natural world. How did, let's say, and when he talks about nucleotide sequences, again, there's different types of nucleotides. There's, obviously there's two main categories, DNA and RNA, that are relevant biologically. So he doesn't specify whether he's talking about the DNA or the RNA. Both are relevant with regard to the ribosome. But whatever the case, whatever he's actually talking about, let's just say he's talking about the whatever the ultimate DNA is. So how does that DNA sequence come about? It comes about the same way that all the other DNA sequences are, right? So it codes for a particular RNA sequence, and that is transcribed, and it is translated, and and then what if something is functional from that, then something is functional from that, right? So, but that's really, I don't think what he's getting at. He wants to know, where did this process get started? How did the first nucleotide sequence that created a ribosome, where did that come from?
That's not even evolution anymore. That's abiogenesis. That's an entirely different topic.
It's a kind of an abiogenesis, right? So he's wanting to know, what is the absolute origin for this particular biological unit, like whatever it is. Whether it's ribosomes doesn't really matter. It could be anything, right?
Zach,
ribosomes are interesting.
Mitochondria used to be its own independent cell. It got absorbed at some point in our history, right?
So that is the best hypothesis that we have for why mitochondria appear to be prokaryotic in a lot of their characteristics. It's, for example, mitochondria have their own DNA. They have their own genomes that are inherited matrilineally. So the best explanation for that we have right now is that the mitochondria was some sort of a prokaryote that was sort of synthesized in with maybe another prokaryote and created the origin of the eukaryotic cell. So all eukaryotic cells that we know of have mitochondria. The other such event that would have happened in a similar way would have been chloroplasts being synthesized in plant cells. So that would be the big major division that sent plants in their direction because they acquired the chloroplast organelle. That was probably also a prokaryote.
I know, Jeremy, I hope I can, I'm going to try to speak for him here. But just to put this to bed, Dr. Zachary Moore, in your expert opinion, these processes that he's speaking of, first off, you would agree that they require multiple steps, yes?
Oh, sure.
Okay, and each step has to be beneficial according to scientific theory.
Not necessarily, right? So there's different steps that could either contribute nothing, right? So something could get modified.
Lateral drift, or what's it called? Yeah.
Genetic drift. Genetic drift. You can have within. So there's a whole thing that I get into in Evolution 101 about sequence functional redundancy. You can actually have, because the genomic code is so redundant, you can have lots of different variations mutationally that are still functionally equivalent, right? So you can introduce sort of accidental mutations that really don't make any difference at all because the genetic code is fairly flexible. But all of these questions, right? So if you dig down and if I spend an hour going through all the things, all the concepts that he's building in here that have no business being in here, if I get down to the best case scenario of what he's actually asking and dig down, and you're right, he is asking about origins. Where did these things come from? How did these things come about? The ultimate answer, as you alluded to with abiogenesis, is we don't know. Right? So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, ultimately, how any of these things got started. But now we ask the question, okay, if the answer is I don't know, what is the significance of that? Right? So what Jeremy wants to say is, aha, you said I don't know, therefore God. Yep. Therefore, creationism is the best explanation. That does follow. Even if the answer to all of these questions is I don't know, and it may be, even if that is the case, it does not follow that creationism is a better explanation, because whatever explanation does satisfy all these questions has to be consistent with what we already understand in science. It has to be consistent with all the other theories that we've already put together, and creationism is not that. So whatever the explanation might be, it can't be creationism. because it's totally inconsistent with everything else that we know about science.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. I've got, let's see. I've got two more questions, one question and one saved round. But before I do that, I'm going to go back to these questions. Just glance over them one more time. If anything jumps out at you, you want to comment on before we get off of this horse.
Well, it's just another here. So towards the end, how did the motor protein get on it and know which direction to go? So proteins don't know anything, right? So I saw that. He's assigning, agency and intentionality to these molecules that, I understand where he's coming from and I understand why he's using that language. But if you're approaching science in a scientific way, you should be avoiding this or you will be made to look like a fool.
That jumped out at me too, to know how to do this, to know it's assuming an intelligent agent right off the bat, which just, it poisons the well. Another expert question. In your expert opinion, since you're in mainstream academia, is it a big conspiracy to keep the published journals and papers and studies that do not rely on naturalistic explanations? Is there an anti-supernatural bias in mainstream academia?
Well, so I'll answer this in two ways. There is not a bias against allowing creationists to publish. Doug Axe has been published. Stephen Meyer has been published. Michael Behe has been published, although once he started working for the Discovery Institute, his publication record went, right off the cliff. So there's not look, it doesn't matter what you believe. If you have something that you have discovered or you can describe as something that some hypothesis that you've explored and that you've worked on in the lab and you've compared your results, let's say with other people in your field, and you've asked them what they think and they think that this is something interesting and you can tell a unique scientific story with this, then yes, you can write that up, submit that to a journal, and they will publish it. And it's happened. All the major members of the Discovery Institute have all had things published in scientific journals. Being said,
go ahead. Sorry.
That being said, there's not a bias against supernatural explanations, but there's a definitional problem for supernatural explanations. So supernatural explanations are, by definition, non-scientific explanations.
Thank you.
So
exactly.
if you were to write up a scientific paper that had a scientific explanation for some phenomenon that you saw, like let's say that you saw mutations happening in these cells, and you said, well, look, my hypothesis is that it's these little mutation fairies that slip down into the petri dishes at night, and they shrink to the size of the DNA molecule, and they actually physically change that, and they make the mutations happen. And they're completely immaterial. They're undetectable by any equipment we might have in the laboratory. But that's my hypothesis. Number one, how do you test for that, right? How do you if you're doing science, you're starting with the hypothesis and you're trying to come up with experiments that can either confirm or disconfirm that hypothesis. If you're talking about mutation fairies that are immaterial, can't be detected by anything, how do you confirm or disconfirm that idea? You can't. So you can't do science with that concept, all right? This is why we say that science is methodologically naturalistic. The methods of science require the presumption of naturalism. That's not to say that all science is metaphysically or philosophically naturalistic, right? So you don't have to be a naturalist to be a scientist. In fact, the top scientist in the country, the head of the NIH, is an evangelical Christian. Francis Collins, for the record, a very good friend of Christopher Hitchens, by the way. He's an evangelical Christian. He is arguably the top scientist in the country, the most powerful scientist in the country. He's an evangelical Christian. So you absolutely can do science and be a Christian. But what does Francis Collins say about creationism? Creationism has nothing to do with science. So Francis Collins actually advocates for a concept called theistic evolution, which is growing in popularity. So right now, there's as sort of Christianity shrinks around the evangelical fundamentalists, they're sort of rallying around creationism to sort of maintain their own fragile faith. But the more progressive Christians have no problem at all accepting theistic evolution, which is to say, yes, science tells us that evolution explains the diversity of life that we have right now. And there's no reason at all that God couldn't have done it, right? So if God is truly an omnipotent God, right, who can do anything, who can make anything happen, why couldn't he have spun up a process billions of years ago that ultimately resulted in the evolution of species on the planet Earth, right? Only a small, unpowerful, fragile little God couldn't have done that. And that's the God that creationists believe in.
I say this way too often until I'm blue in the face, but tell me if this is, when I'm confronted with this, my layman's explanation is science is a tool. Think of it as a hammer or a pair of pliers in your toolbox. You got philosophy, you got, to some extent, theology is a subset of philosophy. So you got philosophy, you got science, you got mathematics. There's your toolbox. All right, it's a good working tool, but this tool is good for detecting and measuring natural phenomenon. Anything outside of that, the tool doesn't work. You wouldn't use pliers when you would need a hammer. And that's how I look at it. And I don't think we have a tool right now for measuring, predicting, testing, falsifying supernatural explanation. And until we do, it's a big question mark. And if you said, like in your example, fairies did cause the mutations, if you have no way to test it, we run into this with string theory. String theory is beautiful, elegant on paper, but as of right now, we have no way to test it or verify it or falsify it. It looks great, but that's why it's still on the fringes. It's not being fully accepted.
Well, and the same was true with general relativity. Right. So when that was first elucidated, yeah, it was the same thing. Yeah, this all makes sense, but we can't know. But they were able to validate it later, and that's great, right? And so any sort of theoretical physics, right? That's why we have theoretical physics. Any sort of theoretical physics should be regarded as such, right? We need evidence, but there's no such thing as theoretical biology.
Good point. And that would lead me to, because we've had Hugh Ross as a guest through the Atheist and Christian Book Club, who's another, what'd you call it, theistic evolution proponent. And we need people like this. And to circle back to the original, to the beginning of this talk, you said the progressive Christians versus the fundamentalists, these progressive Christians that, I see it too. Atheist influencers, whether it be on YouTube or out hitting the streets and doing the good stuff, far too many of them discount these progressive believers and don't consider them allies. And I think that's a big waste. I think we need to consider them allies. We need them. We need those types.
Oh, absolutely. And so this was, I gave a talk at American Atheist Conference this year, and that was part of the focus of my talk was what I want to be very clear, especially in sort of a post-Trump America, the problem believers are the evangelicals. And we need to be very clear about that. It's sort of hashtag not all Christians. The evangelicals are the ones that are really causing the problems and are the ones that we really need to worry about. And if we're going to have enemies, we'll have enemies among the evangelicals. But the other Christians that exist, and there's not as many as there used to be, admittedly, because a lot of them are becoming nuns. But they still exist. Progressive Christians still exist, and they still have institutions, and they still have some power. And we can partner with them on different things, different interfaith things. I just did a project with some progressive groups last weekend, in fact. So I recommend any atheist who has any interest in doing sort of that sort of thing, please do so. We do need, we will still need firebrands to fight the evangelicals. But we'll also need diplomats to go out and sort of make inroads in with progressive communities.
That leads us to any saved rounds, and do your plugs one more time, or if there's anything you left out. Jeremy, I hope this answer at least got you on the right track to answer. It won't. Okay,
it won't.
Well, here's holding out hope. But
I've been doing this sort of thing with creationists for a long time. It's not going to make any difference. No. I may be too flippant about that, because there have been some people who've come back to me after the fact. It's not a huge number, but there have been some people that have come back to me after the fact. I've been doing this for a long time, that say, "Look, you know, we had a debate, or we had some exchange, or whatever, and at the time I thought you were full of crap. But it's 5 years later, it's 10 years later, and I gave yours. It kept on nagging at me, and I kept on looking in and reading into it, and my mind has changed." So that does happen. If that does happen with Jeremy. I hope so. I hope, when that happens, Jeremy, come back and rewatch this video, and then you'll laugh at yourself just the way that we are too.
Yeah, call me naively optimistic, but we have received, I don't know, it's probably around a dozen. We've been doing this channel. You're one of the original. I think you were the original on location interviews that we ever did on this channel. When I went to up to your place in Keller. Yeah. That was. So we're about 2.5 years old, and since then we've had about a dozen people come and say, I'm not in this game to change minds. I'm really not. I'm really just to put a positive face of atheism, to be amicable, and to find truths. I'm seeking truths. But around a dozen times we get messages, emails saying, "Listen, you had a huge impact on me, and guess what? I'm an atheist now." So
nice.
That's very humbling. So I hold out hope for Jeremy. We didn't really get down in the weeds, the nuts and bolts of the processes, and I really didn't want to, but I hope this answers the questions. So Zach, saved rounds and your plugs.
So once again, Evolution 101 is a podcast that exists out there. So check that out if you're interested in learning more. Apologia podcast as well, if you're interested in some sort of atheist Christian dialogue. And then if you're in the Dallas area, check out the Fellowship of Free Thought Dallas and Camp Quest, Texas. Camp Quest is a great resource. My kids they went 6 years in a row, and they're counselors now. They started out as campers, then is it called CITs? It was CITs, and then now they changed Phoenix. Yeah. And now they're both of them are full-blown counselors. That's great. Yeah, they love it. It's great. There's Camp Quest, Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico. They're all over. Yeah, look for those. Fellowship of Free Thought Dallas is I think numbers wise, it's the biggest atheist organization in Dallas-Fort Worth. Well, it's kind of difficult to measure, but so many events you guys do. Well, based on the people that have subscribed on Meetup, we are the largest atheist organization now in the world. Wow. Are you? Yeah. Wait, American Atheists? Well, so this is specifically through Meetup. Oh, through Meetup. Wow, that is something. There's several thousand people, a couple thousand people on Facebook as well. And, it's kind of impossible to say who else might be tangentially connected to it through other means. I don't know. But it is big. Ours is the oldest in North Texas. And I thought yours is it's got to be, as far as active members and numbers, just sheer number of events. And you guys are always doing a picnic or something. There's always something going on. So as far as that and active members, you guys take it. It's really good stuff. Thank you, Zach, so much for coming. And I hope everyone enjoyed this. And we will talk to you all next time. Absolutely. Take care.